Today I'm celebrating Alan Watts, a man who has inspired me profoundly for much of the last 3 decades, which is incredible when I think that the guy had, wow, I believe he had died before I was even born. No, it must have been later. But yet I had never heard of him, never had the opportunity to see him, and certainly had died before I'd had the opportunity to read him, see him as a living entity. And yet, thank goodness, nearly every talk he gave had been recorded. And although he is a colourful character with a checkered past, in the sense that he was basically a functioning alcoholic, that he was an absent father, that he was a bit of a philanderer, as I understand it. And yet, he never pretended that he wasn't any of those things, although it is actually remarkable that his alcoholism wasn't more evident. But he was someone who had mastered the art of the vine. He was someone who understood his capacity for drinking and his way of drinking in the way of the Shaolin drunken master. It was almost a spiritual practice for him. He certainly wasn't one of those annoying, flailing drunks that was responsible for violence in his life. Or at least that's not my understanding. Alan Watts, I would dearly love to see someone challenge his ideas. I'm yet to see someone make a significant philosophical objection to his work. He was so eloquent and was so capable of putting the inexpressible into words that I defy anybody to point at flaws in his understanding. He spent much of his life, I mean, if you've never heard of Alan Watts, then one should know that he was pretty much responsible for bringing the understanding of Eastern philosophy to the West, with series of talks and radio shows and television shows where he would focus on Buddhism, specifically Zen Buddhism, but also Hindu practices, and exploring those through a Western lens. He was someone who himself had studied theology and was even an ordained Anglican minister for a time. And when I've heard him talk about his practice of worship in his churches, he talked about making celestial whoopee, of really getting away from the dreary practice of bowing one's head in a God-fearing Christian style to an expression of celebration of what it is to be alive, to be of God, to be caught up in this seemingly infinite mystery of life. Alan Watts would tour extensively for many, many years, expounding on a great variety of themes, completely unscripted, basically channeling his awareness, challenging everybody else's awareness, and putting into words those subtle and delicate things of what it is to be alive, with great precision, with great humour, with great care. I mean, it's funny because some people find his voice immediately off-putting as a well-spoken Englishman. I don't know why I never found that objectionable. Because I understand that kind of resistance to posh accents, and he definitely was a posh boy, but because he had always been a rebel, despite his posh background, that's kind of why I guess I've always given him a greater sense of acceptance, why he speaks to me. I suppose when I was young, I went to a boys' school for a while that had that kind of inflection in some of the teachers and the parents of children that went there. So I was familiar with it and resistant to it, and so I suppose I also kind of appreciate Alan Watts in his kind of sense of having been very close to that world and come through it. He expresses himself with such love and compassion and tenderness, but with such analytical precision. He really is the meeting point of that logical and left brain thinking with a more esoteric, right-brained, creative way of perceiving the universe. Alan Watts was a great student of Carl Jung, who is another man who impresses me greatly. And they finally met, and Alan Watts had always been resistant to the idea of going into therapy, and I think meeting Carl Jung presented him with the opportunity to finally meet someone who maybe he could have elected to go into therapy with. And by all accounts, their meeting was one of mutual respect and of twinkling eyes, looking at each other across the chasm of their different cultures and backgrounds and generations, and they're finding a meeting of minds. There are many people that I'm inspired by that cast doubt upon the idea of therapy as a practice, and yet I also retain this incredible admiration for Carl Jung. So I suppose in a way Alan Watts has been the closest that I've come to really going into therapy. I've spent hundreds of hours listening to his stuff, falling asleep to it, waking up to it, and I feel that he has been in some ways a very powerful father figure for me. So I take great pleasure and in celebrating a day dedicated to Alan Watts, and I'm very, very proud and pleased to be able to honour him with a moment's silence to give thanks for his life, for his contribution, Mr. Alan Watts.